The reigning back-to-back national champion UConn Huskies are preseason number 3, and Goldilocks wants to know, too high, too low, or just right?
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, and happy Wednesday, folks. This is the only national college hoop show out there, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We are your co-hosts. I'm Andy Patton. He is Isaac Shade over there, and you are joining us at the place to get your college basketball content Monday through Friday, 52 weeks out of the year. We are here for you on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Want to thank all of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day, and give a special shout out to those everyday listeners and those of you hanging out with us in the Locked On College Basketball Discord channel. Today's episode is brought to you all by FanDuel. Folks, place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started. Well, the AP preseason poll is out, and in order to make sure his stuff got out right beforehand, Ken Pom released his rankings for the entire season just a couple hours beforehand. It was a huge amount of content and discussion and discourse and everything around college basketball. A great sign that the sport is almost here. Less than 3 weeks until the first game of the season, and we're breaking down all things AP poll here on the show. We're talking about the tip-top teams. We're talking about which teams might not make the tournament who are ranked in the top 25 or even in the top 10. We're talking about which unranked teams might make the Final Four, something we've seen a lot in just the last couple of years. We're also talking about the fact that there's only one mid-major team that is ranked in the top 25. That's a little less than we typically see, and that team is going to be joining the Pac-12 in just a couple of years as well. All sorts of fantastic stuff. Isaac, before we get started, I'm going to toss a trivia question at you. I know typically do these for Tuesday episodes, but we're going to push this one a day later after the AP poll came out and the AP women's poll came out. We now have all 3 polls out, and we have one team that is in the top 10 for football, men's basketball, and women's basketball.
Oh my.
You who that program is. We can answer that question at the end of the show for those of you listening trying to wonder who that might be. Do you got any quick guesses before we go on? No.
My brain goes first to UConn, but it's obviously not, because they won't be top 10 at football, but I'm guessing they are at both. I actually haven't even – I know the women's poll came out. I haven't had a chance to look at it yet. I'm guessing they're top 10 in basketball.
I think they are, yeah. It's not UConn. Yes. No, their football team is having a decent year, but they're not a top 10 football
I also
team.
get, like, Texas comes to mind because they're number 1 in football, and I think they're probably going to be top 10 in women's. Mm-hmm. And I know they're ranked in the men's, but I think they're, like, in the teens, right?
Yeah. No, it's not Texas either. That's a good guess, though.
I'll keep thinking.
You keep thinking. We'll talk about it to end the show. But we want to start. We're going to talk about Kansas, who ended up being the preseason number 1 team. We're going to talk about what that means for the Jayhawks and Bill Self's team. But I also want to talk about UConn. Let's start the conversation with Danny Hurley and the Huskies. They've won back-to-back national championships. They're also replacing 4 starters from last year's team. They ended up being 3rd in the AP poll. Dan Hurley is upset about it. Not a surprise there, knowing Dan Hurley. He said he can't believe or can't understand why they wouldn't be number 1. Of course, preseason polls are not based on the previous year. They are based on the upcoming season. That's a quick primer as to why they wouldn't end up being number 1. But there is some question of whether they deserve the benefit of the doubt all the way up to being that preseason number 1 team, or whether you kind of evaluate them based more on the fact that this is a team that doesn't look quite the same as last year's roster. And I think there's kind of arguments on both sides for this UConn team at this point.
Andy, first off, I appreciate your Goldilocks reference in the cold open, as I recognize the own hair on my head. I get comments all the time on our show about Goldilocks or Shirley Temple or things like that. So that hits pretty close to home for me. Thank you. As for UConn, look, I think there's a level at which their floor is so solid because of the Danny Hurley it all. For me, I'm still Bill Self number 1, but man, Hurley is making his case to be right up there with him. I think they are a very solid team, Andy. I think, like, I look at the top 8, and I think, because we often talk about, like, that's what you need to compete is 8 guys. and I could rattle that off and feel good about it.
Yeah.
But I don't know that they have, like, you've had Tristan Newton running the show the past couple of years. You've had Steph Castle as the stud freshman, but like in a supporting kind of role where it's like, you go be the uber athlete defensive stopper kind of guy. And so as I look at it this year, and I think Samson Johnson's going to be great. I think Terrace Reed's going to be great. But are they Donovan Clingan? I don't think so. I look at Alex Caravan and I'm like, he's so good. But if he's the best player, I don't know. And like with Liam McNeely, or he's going to be really, really good.
Yeah.
But is Mahaney going to be able to take a big step forward? What does Solo Ball do? Diarra step in it? So I think there are enough question marks, Andy, where I would not have them number one. But I think the floor and the benefit of the doubt and the Dan Hurley, I think they're in the right neighborhood. You add on it.
Yeah, I haven't done my top 25 yet, but I feel like, just based on kind of gut instinct and looking at the teams that are around them in the rankings, I'm more likely to have them in the 7 to 10 range. And I don't want that to come across as being a hater of
why
them.
Do you no, Andy, you hate Dan Hurley. Why? Come on, tell us why.
Having a team ranked 7, 8, or 9 is not hating in any stretch. It's just more of I'm worried. You kind of touched on it a little bit, the star power aspect of this team. Like, they have a lot of good players. They have a lot of players who were good role players last year who are going to step into bigger roles. And I'm not doubting that that's going to work successfully. Hassan Diarra stepping into a bigger role is going to be successful in the sense that he's a good player who is capable of doing that. Same with Ball, same with Samson Johnson. But again, I think a lot of UConn's success last year was the fact that those guys didn't need to be in those big roles and were able to be role players who weren't asked to play 25, 28, 32 minutes a game. Whereas this year they're going to be asked to do that. And then other players have to step into those roles. And again, I think they'll have the guys who can do that to an extent, but are they going to be as good? Who replaces Tristan Newton? And if you think Hassan Diarra can do that, who then replaces Hassan Diarra? Those are the kind of questions that I have about this team. Who is the leading scorer night in and night out?
Right.
If they don't have a leading scorer consistently, is that able to function? Is that able to work in a system like theirs? Last year, they had some games where Cam Spencer would go off, where Caravan would go off, where Clingan would go off. Maybe that's the situation this year, but I just feel like it's more of like a group of very good but not elite players, as opposed to last year's team, which had multiple elite players and then a really good core of role players kind of outside of that. And I'm just not quite sold that this team is there. Does that mean that they won't be able to be a top 10 team, win the Big East, get a top 2 seed? No, I think all those things are within the realm of possibility, if not likely, for this UConn team. But I'm not ready to just automatically throw them back at the top of the rankings when they lost a ton of talent last year, and we haven't seen exactly how they've replaced that talent on the court yet.
And I feel so much better about it when your alpha male is your 1 or your 5, like they've had the past couple of years, like going back to Adama Sanogo and looking at Tristan Newton and all the things those guys did, with your best player being your kind of small ball 4, right? Like I think that's what we might be looking at.
Yeah.
And obviously, who knows what will happen, but I'm not convinced. And of course, Andy, we say all this and it's bulletin board material for Dan Hurley, and we doubt him at our own risk. But I think that's the nature of what we have to do, is call it like we see it, right? And I think right now, that's what we're seeing. As you said, look, even a lowered ceiling, we still have UConn top 10 easily, but maybe just not where they've been the last 2 years. And all of that, Andy, is because the talk all off season has been that Kansas and Alabama appear to be the 2 best teams in the country. And I know there's conversation with UConn. I know there's conversation with Houston and maybe a couple others. But to me, it's pretty clear that Kansas and Bama on paper are 1 and 2. The question all offseason has been who would be 1 and who would be 2. It wound up being Kansas 1, Bama 2. Andy, in your opinion, are they the top 2? And did the media voters for the AP get that order correct?
Yeah, I think they probably should be the top 2. I think you could make a really strong argument for Houston. I again, haven't done my top 25 yet, but there's a chance that I will have Houston second. Between Kansas and Bama, I don't think you can go wrong either way. Mark Sears is a better overall point guard than DeJuan Harris, but Harris is a really gifted passer. You look at the front courts, obviously Hunter Dickinson is an incredibly talented player offensively, whereas Alabama adds more of a defensive focused big man. And then you have Grant Nelson, who can kind of do a little bit of everything. KJ Adams, like the teams are fun to compare because the players are very different at each position in a lot of ways. Obviously, Bama's going to play a high flying offense. They're going to get up and down the floor. They're going to shoot a ton of threes. They're not going to be as talented on the defensive end of the floor, most likely, although they're still being projected to be pretty good on that end. Adding Omarui definitely helps there in the front court. But I'd probably lean Kansas, but I think there's really strong arguments for Alabama, and I don't see any issue with having them at number one either.
I completely agree. And just interestingly enough, as we carry on, none of this top three in Kansas, Bama, UConn are top three at KenPom. That's Houston, Duke, Auburn. So just an interesting note. Andy, very quickly before we move on, we have had four very different teams be preseason number one the past 4 years following COVID in terms of how they ended up doing. 4 years ago, Gonzaga was preseason number one in the 2020-21 season, went undefeated all the way until the national championship game when Baylor won. So that was the national runner-up, 31-1, 15-0 in the WCC. I mean, ridiculous. The next year, Gonzaga was preseason number one again, 1 seed, lost to Arkansas in the Sweet 16. The year after that was the year that Carolina became the first ever preseason number one to miss the NCAA tournament. And then last year, we know that Kansas was preseason number one, had some injury issues, and wound up as a 4 seed, lost to Gonzaga in the round of 32. So, Andy, my question quickly before we move on is we've had these 4 different kind of outcomes of the last 4 preseason number ones. Which of those 4 do you think Kansas is most likely to be?
I think it's probably going to be most similar to that 21-22 Gonzaga team. The team that earned a 1 seed and justifiably earned that 1 seed. They were 28-4 in the regular season, 13-1 in conference play, earned a 1 seed. They kind of struggled in the tournament even before they lost to Arkansas in the Sweet 16. They had a little bit more trouble with the 16 seed Georgia State than you'd expect them to, but they still won. And then they were down, I think, 10 at halftime against Memphis before Drew Timme went crazy in the second half, led Gonzaga to a win there. They kind of limped through those first 2 games and then just could not get anything going against that Arkansas team, Eric Musselman's squad. So for me, Kansas doing something similar to that, where they do well in the Big 12, they do enough to earn a 1 seed or a 2 seed, and you're kind of feeling like, okay, they were a justifiable preseason number one in the sense that they finished the season as a 1 seed or a 2 seed, but then they stumble in the NCAA tournament. I think defense could be an issue in the front court for them with Dickinson in particular. We'll see if KJ Adams can kind of shoulder a big load there. But I wouldn't be surprised to see Kansas have a somewhat similar trajectory. More so, sure, they could be the national runner-up. That wouldn't stun me either. This team's very good. I'd be shocked if they missed the NCAA tournament, but anytime a number one preseason team misses the tournament is going to be shocking. There's reasons it's only happened once. And then I'd be surprised if they kind of go the same path as last year. I wouldn't be shocked if that happened where they end up like a 4 or 5 seed and don't do as well in the tournament. But I think the most likely outcome is they get a really favorable seed, make it to the Sweet 16, and don't advance beyond that.
Andy, that was my exact choice. I think they take on more losses than that team just because Big 12. But outside of that, I think that's the more likely thing. And in terms of NCAA tournament success, I think it's somewhere between Sweet 16 and the Gonzaga national runner-up team. I think, you feel like with with Kansas's roster, they've got to feel like it's kind of Elite 8 or bust maybe. And so that would be the one difference with it. But don't want to reiterate that because it's time to keep moving. Andy, will a preseason top 10 team miss the NCAA tournament? We're going to give our best guess on that. And is it possible that an unranked team makes it to the Final Four? Guess what, folks? We've had 4 teams do that the last 2 seasons. Not as crazy as you might think. We'll give you our answers for that in just a second. Right after I tell you about Game Time, we are less now than 3 weeks away from the start of the college basketball season, and there's absolutely nothing better than the atmosphere of a college basketball game. The anticipation of what's going to happen, the energy of the crowd, knowing that the unexpected could happen at any minute. We are so geeked out for another season full of incredible moments, and thankfully, there's a ticketing app called Game Time that helps you get great tickets at a great price, and not even just for sports. Game Time has tickets for all live events. Great news. When you're trying to get those tickets, Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets even easier. It filters out the fluff to show you only the best deals on the best seats so you don't have to waste your time. So whether it's game time ticket coverage, the lowest price guarantee, or the views from your seat that you can find in the app, Game Time has got you covered. We just talked a little bit about Kansas. Champions Classic is coming up early in the season this year. They're facing Michigan State at State Farm Arena in Atlanta. Tickets for that event are on sale for $80 a piece. Man, that's incredible, because not only do you get that game, but you get Duke, Kentucky as well. Part of Game Time super deals. Go get on it and take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Terms apply. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. Andy, we're going to do a little what ifing. We're going to, unfortunately, drop some top 10 preseason teams, but then we're going to raise up some preseason unranked teams. So we're going to start with the sad side and then move to the happy. And the question is, which top 10 team is most likely to miss the 2025 NCAA tournament? And as a reminder, this didn't happen last year. All the preseason top 10 made it. 4 of the top 25 didn't in totality, but 2 seasons ago, North Carolina was preseason number 1 and did not make the NCAA tournament. So Andy, who is your pick of the preseason top 10, which let me remind everyone who that is? Kansas, Alabama, UConn, Houston, Iowa State, Gonzaga, Duke, Baylor, North Carolina, and Tommy Lloyd's Arizona Wildcats. Who is your pick?
Yeah, I'm going with Arizona. Number 10 on the list. I know it feels kind of cheesy to pick the team that's the lowest ranked of the top 10 teams, but this doesn't happen all that often. We went back 4 or 5 years, and it's fairly infrequent that a top 10 team doesn't make the tournament. Usually a top 15 team doesn't make the tournament. Almost always at least one or usually 3 or 4 teams from the top 25 don't make it. But top 10 is a little bit more rare. But Arizona, there is absolutely a reality where they struggle to have success in the Big 12. There's a new conference, new travel schedule, new opponents, new everything for this team, and that can really mess with teams. Just longer flights, like longer travel, playing in new arenas that you're unfamiliar with, playing a different style of basketball. Arizona plays a different style than a lot of teams in the Big 12. And I think that in some ways that could help them, but there's also a reality where it is a challenge. And they struggle with some of those matchups against more physical teams. And I think you look at Tommy Lloyd's team, and they're replacing their entire front court. They lost Umar Ballo, hit the transfer portal. They lose Keshad Johnson. He stays in the NBA. Pella Larson's out the door. Like they're losing a lot of talent in that front court. Yes, they get Caleb Love back, but Caleb Love is inconsistent. He is he can win you games, he can lose you games. And I think there's going to be games this year where Caleb Love may cost them a game or two. Again, he might win them a few too, but with Caleb Love being your primary scorer, with a couple of additions that I really like, Trey Townsend coming over from Oakland, he's outstanding. I think he's going to be a good piece. Toby Awaka was a nice role player for Tennessee last year. Anthony Del Orso's transfer from Campbell, but 2 of those guys are coming from low major programs in Del Orso and Townsend. Sometimes those guys don't necessarily play at the same level, or sometimes they really struggle to adjust going from that level all the way to the Big 12 and expecting to have a big role for this team. So there's enough questions that while I'm not projecting that Arizona misses the tournament, of the teams in the top 10, there's enough questions around Tommy Lloyd's team that I could see them dropping a handful of games to the best teams in the conference, like Kansas and Baylor and Houston, but also dropping a game to, a TCU or a Kansas State or even West Virginia or somebody like that. And then suddenly you're in a position where you got 12 losses on the year and you lose in the first round of the Big 12 tournament. And now you're kind of in that conversation. Like, again, not projecting it, but could it happen? Absolutely. I could see a reality where Tommy Lloyd's team doesn't do what they're supposed to do this year.
And the irony of that, Andy, and this is also going to be a transitional great segue, is that Caleb Love was on that North Carolina team that started preseason number 1 and missed the tournament. And Andy, the reason I say it's also a great segue is because my pick here is North Carolina. Look, there's a couple things that play into this. Number 1, just obviously the history of it. We're just 2 seasons removed from this happening to the Tar Heels. I think, Andy, we probably think of that more as a one-off where Carolina kind of wasn't incredible the season before, kind of got hot, made that run. Brady Manick brought it all together, and then it just didn't have that the next season. And we think that they do. There's enough talent in the backcourt this year where you expect that to be, whether it's the return of RJ Davis, who's going to be, preseason first team All-American, and Elliot Cadeau, bringing in Cade Tyson and talented freshmen, Ian Jackson and Drake Powell, Seth Trimble coming back, etc. But there's the big questions in the front court where North Carolina didn't get the dudes they were trying to get that could replace Armando Bacot, whether it was Umar Ballo, who we just talked about, or Cliff Omori, who's at Alabama, Jonas Adu at Arkansas, et cetera, et cetera. And Andy, I think part of it is that because we've seen North Carolina play for a certain way for so long, until we see what they're going to be with a different look front court, it's going to be hard to know exactly what Hubert Davis is going to be. For those, as this pops on Wednesday, you'll get some viewing of that last night on Tuesday as Carolina plays a charity exhibition at Memphis. So maybe even today, as you're watching or listening to this, you might have some more idea. But that's my pick, Andy, because of the front court and because of the recent history.
Let's talk about the opposite, the happier side of things here. Which teams that were not in the AP Top 25 did not get the preseason ranking are most likely to make the Final Four? Because I think we've had 4 of these in just the last 2 NCAA tournaments. Last year, of course, it was that miracle run by NC State, the Wolfpack, not only not ranked in the preseason, not ranked throughout the year, didn't do well in the regular season, yet got hot in the ACC tournament and carried that all the way into the Final Four. And then 2 years ago, 3 of the 4 Final Four teams were not ranked in the preseason. The only one who was San Diego State. UConn, Florida Atlantic, and Miami were all not ranked in the preseason. So this is something that happens that is more consistent, at least recently, than I think a lot of people would expect it to be. And I think it's a nice way to highlight the parity that we see in college basketball in particular. Isaac, who are you going with as a team that wasn't in the preseason top 25 that you think could be in the Final Four this season?
Andy, it's a team that I think should have been in the top 25, and that's Illinois, who is just on the outside looking in. You laughed about like us kind of hedging on our top 10 thing being the 9th and 10th teams. Well, I'm going to take the team that's ranked 26th that I thought should have been in, which first off, Rutgers is ranked at 25, and I don't think they should be. Look, I'm excited to see these 2 freshmen, but I just don't think it's there. Like Ken Pom, for example, has Illinois second in the Big Ten preseason projections and Rutgers next to last. What would that be, 17th in the new Big Ten? Good grief. And so there's that. I recently heard Coach Underwood talking with Matt Norlander of CBS Sports at Big Ten Media Day and discussed how elite, yet again, their offense should be. The direct quote was, quote, "I like our ceiling this year. It's as high as our ceiling has ever been." Now, thankfully, Norlander kind of was like, hang on, what? Really? Because you just lost Terrence Shannon Jr. and Marcus Damask and others. Really? Like, is that a thing? And he doubled down on it. Now, in the same breath, Andy, I got to say that Coach Underwood also laughed at his defense. And another quote, which was even more hilarious, "We've got a 7th grade team in Champaign-Urbana who might hang 100 on us." So, like, I've got to recognize that in the same breath. Right. But let's think about this, Andy. Compare it to last year. Alabama, ridiculous offense, but was an absolute sieve. Sieve? I don't know. On defense. Same with Kentucky. And look, Alabama rocked that all the way to their first ever Final Four. And Illinois kind of was that same thing last year. And so if this offense can get them to where it needs to go, I think they've got a great shot as anybody to making up for that 30-0 run they surrendered to UConn in the Elite Eight last year and making that one further step.
Well, you went with the 26th team in terms of others receiving votes. I went with the 27th team. So again, we're hedging our bets here as the best we can. I'm going St. John's. St. John's to me feels like a team that should have been in the top 25. They were 19th at Ken Pom's rankings. Also a very balanced team, 24th in adjusted offensive efficiency at Ken Pom, 18th in adjusted defensive efficiency for the preseason. So Rick Pitino's team is looking like a team that's going to be good on both sides of the ball. And Rick Pitino's always had success in his second year at a program. Back when he was at Boston, way back in the late 70s, they won the regular season in his second season. When he was at Providence, the second season was the year they went to the Final Four. When he was at Kentucky, they went 22-6 in his second season after a pedestrian first year. When he was at Louisville, they won the conference and earned a 2 seed in his second year. When he was at Iona, they went 25-8 and won the MAC in his second year. Like, this is a coach who obviously has been very successful throughout his career, not just in his second season. But I think you look at the rebuild job he did at St. John's, just tore everything down last year, rebuilt it, added a bunch of veteran guys last year to kind of get a sense of what he wanted to do. A lot of those guys are out the door, rebuilt again with a bunch of pieces in the transfer portal, but adding Kadari Richmond and Devin Smith, I mean, that's just such a tremendous backcourt, so versatile. Both those guys are triple-double watch every single night. You got key returners as well, and RJ Luis. You got Simeon Wilcher, Zuby Ejiofor's back, Brady Dunlap. I think all those guys are going to step in and play valuable roles for this team. I'm really a big fan of this St. John's roster and how things could come together, and I trust Pitino as a coach to get them into a place where they can be competitive in the Big East, finish in the top 3 in that conference, potentially get themselves a favorable single-digit seed. And I know there's not a single person out there who wants to see a Rick Pitino coach team against them in March. So even if this team gets like a 6 seed, the 3 seed and the 2 seed on that side, they're going to be sweating a little bit because they know that Pitino is capable of leading this group, this team that he has for the Johnnies, into at least an Elite 8 or a Final 4. So to me, them and Illinois were the 2 teams that stood out of, like, these are not only teams that should have been ranked, in my opinion, but are very capable of leading teams to deep runs in March. Yeah. Isaac, conference breakdowns. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about how many different teams were in the top 25 from the SEC, from the Big 10, the Big 12, and notably the fact that there's only one team, the Gonzaga Bulldogs, outside of the power conferences that ended up in the top 25. How does that compare to recent history? We'll tell you coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, let's talk about FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place your bets. And you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. And since we're talking Final Four, let's talk about the odds for the teams most likely to make the Final Four. According to FanDuel, Duke is #1 at +190. Followed by both UConn and Kansas tied at +210, Alabama and Houston after that +260. Then you got 3 teams, the Zags, North Carolina, and Iowa State, all tied at +420. And then rounding it out with the Auburn Tigers and Arizona Wildcats at +500. Good odds there. You like those? You like anything else going on at FanDuel? Check it out now, FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, Isaac, let's take a look here at how the top 25 for the AP poll broke down by conference, because it's not exactly what I was expecting to see here. The SEC overwhelmingly has the highest number of total teams in the top 25. 9 of the top 25 teams come from the SEC. Only one of them, Alabama, of course, in the top 10. The rest of them were all 11 through 24. 8 of those teams in that range come from the SEC. The Big 12 is next with 6. 5 of those 6 were in the top 10. They become the first conference ever to have half of the top 10 in the AP preseason poll. Literally the first time it has ever happened. Tremendous top-end talent in the Big 12 this year. The other team, by the way, outside the top 10 is Cincinnati. The Big 10 had 4 teams ranked, the highest one being Purdue, down at 14, so not a lot of love at the very top of the AP poll for the Big 10. The Big East had 3. It's the 3 that we've talked about a lot, the triumvirate, as it were, of UConn, Creighton, and Marquette. The ACC had 2, of course, North Carolina and Duke there. I think there's an argument that maybe there should have been a little bit more love for the ACC. And then, of course, the one non-Power 5 team, the Gonzaga Bulldogs, out of the West Coast Conference. For now, when the Pac-12 gets rebuilt in a few years, the Zags will be there, and we'll see if other teams, San Diego State, Boise State, etc., routinely join them in the top 25 from there. Isaac, what was your kind of initial reaction or a take coming out of how this AP top 25 broke down by conference?
For me, it was the difference in the volume of SEC teams and the top end of the Big 12. So, as you said, 9 SEC teams, but only 1 in the top 10. That means there's 8 SEC teams from 11 to 25. Right. And actually it's 11 to 24. So that means 11 to, whatever. That's wild. But the Big 12 being this top heavy, Andy, is so insane to me, because it's not only 5 in the top 10. It's 3 of the top 5. And dude, it's just crazy, crazy stuff there. But then also, I guess as part of that, the fact that then the Big Ten, which, it and the SEC are the two biggest like money conferences. And when we think of football, like they're the big daddies.
Yeah.
So the fact that the Big Ten has these 18 schools with all of their dollars, and they only, hear me put in quotes around that, only have 4 teams, and the highest of those is 14th. And so there's just interesting volume versus elite and all of that, right? Like with the ACC, such low volume. And as you said, I'm with you, Andy. I think there should be more ACC, but both of those two are in the top 9. And we've continued to see this where the ACC hasn't gotten maybe the volume love that many think they should, but they've continued to pop up in the Final Four. If I remember correctly, there's been at least one ACC team in 7 of the last 9 Final Fours.
Crazy.
Right? Like, so it's just, it's such an interesting dichotomy with all of this, Andy, but man, it's just fun to look at all these breakdowns.
You look at, so the Big 12, the Big 12, the ACC and the WCC, those 3 conferences combined have 9 teams in the top 25. So the same number of teams as the SEC are in the Big 12, ACC, and WCC combined. However, 8 of those 9 teams between the Big 12, ACC, and WCC are in the top 10 compared to 1 in the SEC. That is just a very weird split. Again, I think it makes sense. I think Auburn should be a top 10 team. I think I'm very likely going to have them in my top 10.
Yeah.
But I think I feel pretty good about there only being 2 of these teams in the top 10. Tennessee, you can make an argument. I'm not quite there with A&M necessarily. No. But I think
Arkansas's got to prove it, for example.
Right. I'm also looking at the SEC teams that are ranked, and there's none of them that I feel like, oh, that team obviously shouldn't be ranked. Like, so it doesn't feel like it's wrong necessarily. It's just a strange breakdown. And I think the simple fact is the Big 12 is so top heavy that it really skews the entire rest of the top 25, and the ACC having 2 top 9 teams and nobody else is kind of skewing that a little bit as well. And I think you're right. Maybe Clemson deserves a shout here. I think Pitt could deserve a reasonable shout at least. I know they got some votes. I believe Clemson did as well. And I'm not sure I'm quite ready to put them as a top 25 team. Between them and Wake, like there's some teams that probably are not getting as much love as they probably should coming out of the ACC.
Yeah, in terms of others receiving votes, Wake is the next highest ACC team at 26, 7, 8, 9, 30. And so, yeah, I mean, because Hunter, I think so much of it is Hunter Salas, right? Like, if there's a third person to put in ACC Player of the Year along with RJ Davis and Cooper Flagg, for me, it's got to be Hunter Salas. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, he's going to be the best player on the court in a lot of ACC games, and I think that'll help.
The Gonzaga side of things is I mean, Gonzaga's 6th. That feels about right to me. I don't have any issue with where they're ranked. I think that's a reasonable spot. But yeah, it was an interesting kind of when we looked back on some history. The fact that Gonzaga is the only non-power conference team in the top 25 is rare. Typically, there's 3 or 4. In fact, going back the last few years, last season there was 4. Florida Atlantic, Gonzaga, San Diego State, and St. Mary's. The year before that, again, now Houston, for the last 3 seasons prior to that, was not in the Big 12, so that they add to this conversation in a way that they wouldn't going forward. But 22-23, Gonzaga, Houston, San Diego State, and Dayton. The year before that, Zags, Houston, Memphis, Bonnies, St. Bonaventure, shout out Adrian Wojnarowski. And then the year before that, 2020-21, it was the Zags and Houston. So part of this conversation is pretty simple. Houston's no longer a mid-major school. San Diego State's down. Those 2 things pretty much make up the difference here. St. Mary's, again, also down this year. I think they received enough votes to be like 35th, 36th in that conversation. And I think in Ken Palm, they're around that as well. So they're like kind of a borderline top 25 team. Dayton, obviously, losing a tremendous talent in Deron Holmes contributes as well. But yeah, I can feel pretty confident in saying that the final preseason poll will have more non-power teams than the final regular season poll and postseason poll will have more non-power teams than the preseason poll. Usually there's 4 or 5 at the end of the year. So I'm guessing that this will look different in terms of mid-major teams at the end of the season.
And just one other quick wrinkle, Andy, with it is, like you mentioned, Houston moving into a power conference. Let's also remember that we have 1 fewer power conferences. And so it's kind of like opposite. You would expect one fewer power conferences, more mid-major teams in the poll, but it went the other way. So that to me is just another sign of the centralizing of power of these major conferences, which is why everyone's trying to get into them. And so I think that's just going to be a trend that we need to keep watching. I'm really curious to go back and do the research on how far back do we have to go, where there was 1 or 0 non-power conference teams in the preseason poll.
Yeah. Let's do a trivia question here. For those of you who've been thinking about it, again, as a reminder, the question, there is one team, one program that is in the AP top 10 in football, men's basketball, and women's basketball. Isaac, you talked about a couple of teams that you were projecting. Do you have any other guesses here before we give out the answer?
The only other thing I can think of, and I'll don't react because I want to explain my thinking, is Iowa State, because their men are 5th. I remember their women being really good last year, so I'm going to assume that they are again. And it occurred to me as we were talking that they're having like an under the radar, really good football season. So maybe they're top 10 on the football side.
Did I do a good enough job of not reacting? Because yes, the answer is Iowa State.
I honestly didn't look at your face. So
good. That's good.
Yeah.
I thought that I was trying to stay as neutral as possible. Great shout. Iowa State, top 10 in all 3 sports right now. Really nice sports season happening for the Cyclones. We'll see how that, I think they're going to be great in men's basketball. It's been fun to watch them in football. And like you said, they were really good on the women's side last year and should be one of the creams of the Big 12 crop for that conference as well.
Shout out to my guy, Dan Toney, the biggest Cyclones fan I know. Andy, great show today. So fun to unpack the AP top 25. Folks, we'd love to hear your takes on like maybe a top 10 team you don't think will make the NCAA tournament, or the flip side we did of maybe an unranked team who you think could crash the Final Four. If you haven't subscribed to our show already on video and audio, make sure you do that, man. We're getting so close and you don't want to miss out. Another great way to make sure you don't miss out is by joining the Locked On College Basketball Discord community, where we're talking college basketball all the time. The link for that is in the show notes, and it's absolutely free to join. We'd love to have you come take this ride of the college basketball season with us. Andy, as always, apologies to the lawyer family. Let's go Wildcats. We had Kentucky in the top 25, Arizona in the top 25. That's all I can think of. Anyway, we'll get back to you tomorrow, but until then, peace.